Hello and welcome to this webinar from your friends at AccountingWEB. My name's Tom Herbert, the business editor of the site. Thank you for tuning in, and also thanks to our sponsors Oracle for making this session happen. So today we're going to be covering the occasionally thorny issue of budgeting and planning. No matter what the number is, it's usually wrong. That's the lament of the hard-pressed CFO or finance director. So in this session we're going to be looking a little bit about how cloud technology can potentially help with this issue. And with me are two of the finest minds in budgeting and forecasting. David Hobson, a Director of Cloud Applications at Oracle. Welcome, David. And Martin German, who is Finance Transformation Consultant for Deloitte. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me. We're going to be looking into our crystal balls to forecast how technology can help with planning and budgeting. I'll start with you, Martin. Well, actually, let's look at what we're doing today. First of all, let's go to the slides, the agenda for today. So what are we going to be covering? So we're going to be looking at if there is enough focus on sort of forecasting, budgeting and planning, and what the cloud can do for this. Then we're going to be spending a little bit of time looking at what the cloud can bring to planning and budgeting, before we talk about sort of practical steps you can take to implement the cloud in your company, and look at some examples, ways to personalize your system, and some examples of things that have really driven value. And also we'll have a few minutes at the end for your questions. So if you have any questions, bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions for the panel, you can use the chat window to the side of this video. Depending on your browser, it might be at the bottom of this video. We'll try and answer as many questions as we can. Any we miss, we will answer as part of a post-event article. And if you have any technical issues, which hopefully we won't, but there will be the session available on demand on YouTube afterwards, which we will email you a link through to. We will refer to a few support documents. I'm not sure they're actually below the page, but we will include them in this post-event article, as it were. So back to the panel. Martin, we'll start with you. Do you think there is enough focus on planning and budgeting currently?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting question. So I think, planning, budgeting, and forecasting, it is really important. So, there's nothing more important than understanding where we are today, where we want to be in the future, and how we're going to get there, which I suppose is at the core of planning, budgeting, and forecasting. I think there is, and probably people will recognise this, there's a lot of focus on planning, budgeting, and forecasting, I think, in most organisations. But I think the question, I think where people struggle is the focus in the right areas. Okay, so I think a lot of people, and we know from surveys that we've done, spend a lot of time on the detail and maybe not necessarily as much time as they would like looking into the future and seeing where things are going to come.
Okay, David, is that a fair assessment? I mean, you both spend a lot of time. You've probably done sort of cloud implementations with hundreds of companies. Is that something you've come across?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the area of managing the business and trying to ascertain what positive impact will occur if the planning and budgeting is done well or poorly. So it's not a new topic. But I think the world that we see is changing very quickly. There's a lot of disruptive forces, a lot of things going on where perhaps the importance of planning and budgeting is sort of increasing. So the focus on it is getting ever more critical to business success.
I do speak to a lot of finance directors and CFOs, and the quote that I introduced there at the beginning about the numbers always being wrong is a real quote that I've heard from several people. Why do finance managers find it such a chore?
I think part of it in my mind is that finance do sometimes find it hard work, but that's because there's a number of reasons. I think in some organisations they are relying on outdated technology, or they're relying on multiple manual spreadsheets to pull together the plans, budgets, and forecasts. And that becomes quite a time-consuming, resource effort-intensive task. And therefore, actually, finance are spending a great deal of time, adding numbers up, reconciling them, rather than actually spending that time on the analysis and making sure they can get the numbers right.
Okay, so David.
Yeah, so absolutely agree with that. I mean, complexity is the enemy, and as Martin suggests, there's just a lot of legacy systems, a lot of fragmented data, inconsistent processes. So a combination of the tools and sort of a lack of governance, I guess, results in a world where we sort of get the end result, but not without a lot of hardship and a lot of difficulty and a lot of challenges. So we're trying to streamline things, standardize things, and reduce some of that complexity.
So the three things I'm picking up there are the time it's taking, the complexity of sort of pulling all the strings together, as it were, and the sort of lack of perceived value. Would that be fair, Martin?
I think it can sometimes be seen. I think that is a fair comment. I think sometimes there can be a lack of understanding of what the process is for and why it actually does add value to the organisation. And I think that also sometimes ripples out into the business. So, planning, budgeting and forecasting shouldn't be just a finance-owned process. It's really important that planning, budgeting and forecasting goes throughout the organisation, and the lines of business also need to be involved in that process and own their numbers. And I think that also is about improving the value that the business see that they get out of that process as well as finance.
Yeah, and David, do you think in these sort of uncertain times, uncertain economically, with a huge amount of technology disruption as well, is the process getting harder? Is it getting easier? What are you finding?
I think it's absolutely getting harder and more critical. And I think the real sort of perspective here from what we see in our discussions with a lot of finance execs is that it's also the changing nature of the role of finance execs. So the expectations on them are fundamentally evolving. So whereas the planning and budgeting conundrum in the old world was sort of reconciling actuals, outturn versus the budget and trying to make some sense of that. Why did things occur in the way they did? I think what we're alluding to here is that the changing nature of the market, a lot of competitive threats, a lot of new types of data coming into the business. So finance is actually having to evolve and change with a lot of these market changes that are going on. And this stuff is speeding up, so it's accelerating. So I guess we're trying to get finance function people to be more involved in sort of predictive analytics and forward-thinking extrapolations of information, and trying to spend more time on the inside, as we're saying, rather than just collecting the data and presenting the budgets as kind of an exercise to look at historic rather than future.
So Martin, David's brought this up now. How do you see the sort of future, the sort of cloud technology and the sort of future of budgeting and planning fitting in with this new strategic role that the finance decision maker has?
I think it links to David's point, which is, finance has very much been seen in the past, rightly or wrongly, as, the number crunchers, right? Looking in the rearview mirror, checking and explaining why there's a difference to a plan, budget or forecast against their actuals. Whereas actually, the modern CFO of the future is being challenged and is a key point, a key part of the business, the leadership team, to go and start looking towards the future. And therefore they're expected to be spending more time looking at the future than they are the past.
No, it's a good point. And I think it was a study that you'd sent me over about the amount of time that people were spending generally on budgeting. Could you talk me through the stat from your integrated performance management report?
Yes, of course. So we did a survey of sort of over 500 financial professionals. Majority of respondents were CFOs and group financial controllers. And what we found in that survey is actually people are spending a massive amount of time, producing annual budgets. So people are spending, up to in some instances, over 6 months actually producing a budget. And that budget is going 12, 18 months out into the future. So, a lot is changing. And I think as David's mentioned and you've mentioned as well, there's a lot going on in the marketplace, so things are changing all the time. So actually, if you're spending so much time to try and get some numbers which are 18 months out, by the time you actually get there, they probably are wrong. Back
Yeah.
to your opening statement of, are the numbers right? And it's about how can the cloud enable a faster, more agile process to speed that up and reduce the amount of time that people are actually spending pulling that budget together.
Yeah. So David, where does the cloud fit into all this?
So I think it's interesting. We were talking earlier about the 18 months, 2 years ago, the comment about the cloud, although legitimized in certain business functions around sales and marketing or to an extent HR, when we talk about finance in the cloud, over the last couple of years, there was a question about security. And actually a lot of those concerns through some really extensive scrutiny and due diligence in the projects that we have running now, customers have gone live. I think there's a lot of those fears have been allayed, and we can actually convey a very robust, highly secure environment, particularly for finance function, finance data. So I think the cloud is multidimensional in the sense that there's a lot of marketing and hype around the cloud, but I think the cloud, in our definition, is certainly delivering a lot of value in terms of speed. So what used to happen clearly was very complex systems, a lot of customizations, requirements gathering. So I think now we're leveraging the cloud as an enabler of best practice IT to speed up implementations. And I think the modern applications and the sort of almost consumer-like feel of the applications is giving users a much better experience, so they're more productive. And I think the cloud had been viewed as sort of a cost savings exercise. And yes, it does. We would show and convey the evidence around the cost saving and the model moving from capex to opex. Sort of the rental model of SaaS or software as a service. But I think clearly the cloud is actually allowing for innovation and allowing for a more productive workforce, looking at the right information, allowing them to do more analysis rather than just data collection. So the cloud is actually changing things quite dramatically. And even despite the hype, I think there are some real pragmatic proof points around cloud adoption, and more a question of, when are you moving to the cloud rather than if.
So the cloud obviously has an enormous number of benefits to the organization as a whole. So, ease of access, iterative updates, as David was mentioning, reducing capex expenditure. What planning and budgeting problems can the cloud solve, Martin?
So I think it can solve a whole range of problems. So I think planning and budgeting can sometimes be seen as the top line. Let's manage the financial plan. But actually, when you look in most organisations, there is an awful lot of other planning and forecasting that goes on. So if you look in the HR function, most HR functions are actually sitting there undertaking strategic workforce planning. They're trying to work out what should the shape and size of our organisation be in the future. What have we got in terms of supply? What are we losing people? What's the attrition rates like? Where are we going to get that supply in the future? What recruitment strategies do we need to adopt to actually change our organisational structure and bring that in? So HR are undertaking planning, and fundamentally, once they look there and sit the organisation, that is connected through to finance. Finance then need to model that and say, an organisation of that size, of that shape, with those grades, with those people in it, is going to cost X. And so there is an awful lot of that planning that's going on in the organisation. So that's just one little bit. There are other areas. Sales forecasting again. That's also going on. You've got sales teams out there that need to look at what revenues. Where's that going to come from? So there's a number of different areas that it sort of plays into.
I was going to say one supplemental thought to that, which I think is vitally important to this world of cloud, is the sort of democratization of many companies, particularly mid-sized companies, smaller companies, really wanting the best solutions, but not necessarily being able to afford them. Because the old model, you buy your perpetual license, you buy some hardware, and you have to kind of provision this stuff and set it up and configure it. It was very complex and very expensive. And I think what's fascinating to us now is that not only are the top-tier organizations, the blue chips, starting to adopt this, which certainly gives us a lot of credibility and whatnot, but actually a lot of the small and mid-sized companies are saying, I needed to do planning and budgeting and related, modernization of finance and other business areas, but they now have access in a way that they didn't necessarily. So a lot of these kind of growth companies are finding the cloud actually is more affordable and accessible, and they like the innovation and the update cycles and all those things. So, but I think that's a really important point, that there's a much broader church now that's able to kind of take advantage of good solutions, because the cloud has made it possible.
Brilliant, thank you, David. We've had a comment in from Linda talking about how, we've heard how technology is providing more insight and potentially letting me make better decisions. But sometimes it feels very hypothetical. Could the panel give some real-life examples of this working, a day-to-day real-life example of how a business has benefited from these tools? Thank you very much, Linda. I think we will be covering some real specific examples of implementation later on after this section, I think. So we will. That will definitely be covered. Keep the questions coming via the Cover It Live box underneath. Returning to the discussion, David, we've talked about how the budgeting and planning tools can be potentially improved using cloud technology. So why haven't more companies migrated?
I think certainly the modernization agenda. So we talk to a lot of companies, and they usually say to us that there's a lot of competitive pressures, a lot of operational inefficiency, and often we find companies are kind of saying to us they're having to run twice as fast to stand still. So the complexity of the environments that have been created and have either organically grown or through acquisition or merger or whatever, corporate change. So a lot of companies are struggling to kind of create the space to think strategically about change. So I think that's one aspect. Another aspect is we find where IT projects are instigated without a really strong, compelling business case or sponsorship, they tend not to be as successful, or whatever realization of benefit is diminished. So I think what we're finding now is that we have companies who are kind of in a wait-and-see status quo mode, and they're finding that the difficulty of that complex environment that they have is a hindrance. It's inhibiting them from changing. And this is the point that we were talking about earlier about, this is almost a direction of travel conversation in some regards, is that to modernize doesn't necessarily mean end-to-end full enterprise scope. We can be very specific about an incremental area, a process or a function, and even to the extent that if your back-end financials are Oracle or a competitor's back-end financials, you could still increment and modernize elements in the cloud with a really strong business case. So I think there have been a lot of blockers, but if you look at it in the round, I think we need that sponsorship. We need to be able to create the space to be more strategic rather than just fighting fires and sort of keeping the lights on.
Yeah. And I think I'd add to that, because I think some organisations and some of the clients that I work with sometimes struggle to articulate what the benefits are for for this, and actually sometimes I think there's a lot of thought there that it has to be about getting rid of headcount or saving money, but actually a lot of this is implementing one of these tools is actually sometimes about the things we were talking about earlier. It's reducing the amount of effort that's being spent on non-value-added activities to enable finance to spend more time on value-added activities and increase the analysis, increase the insight they're doing. So that's a huge benefit that people often sometimes forget about when looking at their overall business case as to why are we going to go and do this.
David, you mentioned blockers there about why certain companies hadn't migrated. What are the drivers now? What's pushing this direction of travel, as you said?
I think a lot of it's about the desire for standardization. So we often talk about what constitutes those differentiating processes that really create value, the secret sauce, whatever you want to call it, versus a lot of those back-end processes which just need to run more efficiently. And we talk about, and have done for many, many years, putting in systems vanilla. But nobody ever did. They got customized, they got tweaked, and the result is that the ability to innovate with all that complexity is a big blocker. So I think the drive for a lot of companies now, beyond the cost savings bit, which I think we have some good evidence around that, is they often talk about operational efficiency, needing to do things better, and they want standardization. And for those non-differentiating processes, they just want to have a very clear, very consistent, highly visible and transparent way of doing things, almost to the extent of, why does human intervention need to get involved in certain aspects of finance processes, where you can automate things and standardize them. Those are the drivers that most companies are saying to us that they can't innovate with all this complexity. So how do they make things simpler?
Have you got any specific examples of where you'd be able to automate processes?
Well, I think some of the automation comes from some of the manual work that we talked around earlier around loading data, reconciling. So finance at the moment, and a lot of my clients, where they haven't got the right technology or the latest cloud technology to support their finance organisation, are spending, as we've already mentioned, a lot of time reconciling data, adding data up, real non-value added activities. Whereas a lot of this technology, that can all be done for you. Like that goes away. We don't need to spend that time doing that. So I think that is quite a clear example where there is a lot of manual work. You can get rid of that, and we can save that time going forward.
And that's consistent with us. I mean, we talk to companies and they say, well, we have multiple ERP systems, and we run a lot of stuff off spreadsheets. And we have these conversations. It's like the reconciliation, who's got the right version, it just lengthens the time of getting any positive outcomes. And so I think that the other point that we've sort of touched on is that although companies are saying, I want to move straight to the digital bit, I want to do the real value creating stuff, but if a lot of the back end is either fragmented or broken or inconsistent. So I think those are all sort of drivers of what we're doing here. So there are most of the examples, most of the projects that have gone live or are implementing now, it's an agenda to simplify, rationalize, and automate a lot of that stuff that Martin's talking about, which is very time consuming and trying to get to some version of any truth. But it's just really difficult. So a lot of that is get the basics right. Yeah. You need to automate a lot of this activity to get to the value creating area.
And I think linked to that, I think a lot of organisations that that I speak to, when we talk about drivers for moving to the cloud, cost used to get cited as a big driver, but actually a lot of the benefits that a lot of organisations are seeing is improvements in their processes, removing those manual things that we've been talking about. But also, I think one of the second biggest, benefits that people get that's now a big driver for them is increased transparency. So actually going back to the whole, connected planning and seeing what's going on in different parts of the business, you can get better visibility into what's really driving the business results. And that ultimately, can help drive value, improve the outcomes of the business overall.
I was going to say, I mean, it's interesting when you, as I say, talk about specifics. So I can think of projects that have gone live in the construction industry around cost value reconciliation. Are we bidding for the right projects? Do we actually know how the costs roll up in the delivery of that project? And, in terms of margin attainment, things like that. There's interesting stuff around zero-based budgeting in consumer packaged goods, where they're moving to a ZBB type model, and they're using some of these planning tools to help them do that. Retailers are looking at everything from cost allocations out of a shared service center. So across industry, I often say every industry, every organization size, and every geography, they have to run core finance, but all the planning, forecasting, budgeting, consolidation, all those things around it are crucial to get right. And I think we're helping companies do that.
Zero-based budgeting, I'm just going to pick up on that. Has that sort of come back round with cloud?
And that's the thing. Some of this stuff is just age-old. It's not a new thing, but I guess that where we're seeing the tools and the speed to value in terms of the cloud model is allowing these things to happen or be realized more quickly than perhaps they did in the past.
Yeah, no, I'd back that up. I think, as David said, it's not a new concept, and I think you would have heard about this, years ago, the concept of zero-based budgeting. But I think what we're seeing is, and I think we've both got clients that are now able to actually achieve, what they set out for a few years ago around zero-based budgeting by using these enabling tools and technologies.
Right. How do they enable that budgeting approach better than the traditional methods that they were using?
Well, I think it goes back to some of this manual work that we're talking around. They've now got everything in a centralised place, in a centralised model, where they can see the drivers, they can see how those drivers link to the ultimate revenue and cost that's coming out, and they can model it in a single place. So I think that just removes a lot of the noise that was previously around undertaking those activities and gives them a fresh perspective which they can work from. And actually it's enabling to do that faster. I think zero-based budgeting, for some of my clients, used to mean an awful lot of actual more work, I think, for some of them. They actually, so whilst they would sit there and go, oh, it sounds great in principle, yes, we want to go and do it, they were like, the amount of work for us to actually go and achieve this across the organisation with all of our spreadsheets, with all of our manual processes, it makes planning budgeting worse. So therefore, that was stopping them adopting it. Whereas they've now got new tools, new technologies, actually they can adopt that process, and they're actually going, yes, this is working, and we're getting real results from being able to do that.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. We had a question from Michael T. Thank you very much. Do you think the whole Brexit/business climate will drive change more quickly, or is it more likely to make businesses rein in tech investment? What are you finding, David?
Well, I think a lot of this, so there are no crystal balls, right? So we don't know what the future holds. So I think I sort of purport this concept sometimes about systems built to change are more valuable than systems built to last, in the sense that the changeability of the environment that we operate in and the agility that we need. So I think that the world of Brexit is sort of looming large, and we don't know the ultimate detail of how this is going to affect the tax implications and transfer pricing, whatever it may be. But I guess the fundamental essence of this is that if we strive towards a more simplified, less complex model of understanding where the data is coming from, and let's be clear, this is not just the traditional operational data, but all of that social data, all of that other information that impacts your brand, your market value, etc. So I think part of this is helping companies modernize more quickly, in a more standardized way, to focus on the right things, do more analysis. So whatever Brexit or other initiatives hold, then we'll be better prepared to respond to those and hopefully exploit them and leverage these sort of digital initiatives that are happening. So that would be my view.
Yeah, I love the idea of sort of C-suite executives sat around the boardroom sort of poring over social data or something like that instead of the numbers. But anyway, yeah.
And I think to just back up one of David's points there, I think one of the things that I'm definitely seeing with some of our clients is clients that have adopted this type of new technology can very quickly turn around numbers and risks to their numbers associated with things like Brexit. So they are able to model very quickly potential impacts on their business. So they are running scenarios, a number of what if scenarios. What if currency rates change? They are running that, and in some instances in hours and days rather than weeks and months in some of my other clients, being able to turn around analysis and being able to say this could be the potential impact, and therefore actually start making real life important decisions as a result of that. The flip side is that I've got clients that are at the other end of the spectrum who can't do that, it will take them weeks and months to actually produce any type of analysis along that same thought process, who are actually now coming to us and saying, we need to be able to do this quicker. We need to be able to provide insights to the business. We're getting asked questions. So how can we answer that quicker? And then we're engaging with conversations around their technology, around their processes, to actually go and say, there are solutions, we can implement them, and actually that will improve the insight that you can actually go back to and provide the business. So I think actually, sometimes there's a bit of doom and gloom that, maybe this will stop technology investment. Actually, I think we're seeing a little bit, I'm seeing the flip of that, to some extent. It's actually a lot of people come to us and saying, we need to invest, because actually that will massively help us.
And I think it's absolutely so the trend is this very traditional model of capital expenditure and what the cloud represents, as I've discussed, is sort of a multidimensional view. But certainly the adoption of cloud is actually proving to be a bit of a catalyst, and companies saying, I want to modernize everything. Where do I start? What are the dependencies? What are the building blocks? And your comment, Tom, is interesting about the board looking at social data. But actually, this is an interesting point about if we've done some research with SEMA around intangible assets, and so market value and brand, and companies should be thinking about that, because the traditional model of their go-to-market and what products they brought to the their particular industry and their customer relationships. So that the whole world is just changing. So that data set's getting huge, exponential. I heard a stat: 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. Yeah. So the finance function, though, and their ability to align all this new data, not that they own all of it, but that they help interpret it and align it to the KPIs. So we see the finance function as being the analytical individuals who can sort of extrapolate and align this new information in a way that makes sense and can be leveraged.
Yeah, and I guess it's a skill set thing as well that the finance function are used to collecting and interpreting data, and so these skills are going to be used more and more by the business in a variety of different ways.
I think something actually raises that you just triggered something in my head actually from a couple of real life client examples where actually we found on with some clients that they have had to look when they start to implement these solutions that we're talking about, they've actually had to look at the skills that they do have in finance because actually in some organisations the skills that they've got, because their processes are so manual, because they're having to spend most of the time, they're just ticking and bashing numbers. So actually some of that analytical skill set that we've been talking about, some organisations find they're missing. And so we implement this technology and they sit there and go, what do we do now with it? We've now got, I'm not ticking and bashing numbers anymore. We need a different skill set and a different type of people within finance who can now actually sit there and analyse that data and be better business partners to the organisation. And that's a fundamentally different skill than being able to tick and bash numbers.
It's kind of the rise of the data scientist, or the chief digital officer or data officer, So, I mean, it's an evolutionary thing, but clearly the fight for the talent, and of course if you hire good people and put them in front of a spreadsheet or some legacy system, which is really, you probably won't keep them for very long. So there is a kind of a war for the talent out there for the people who are forward thinking and leveraging those analytical skills.
Yeah, fantastic. Right, so we're going to move on to look at some sort of practical points around sort of implementing the cloud. So, I originally, the first question I'd written was, how can you avoid moving your sort of old processes to the cloud, warts and all as it were. But I guess, Martin, the question should be, how do you move the good stuff over?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think what we're definitely seeing, with the cloud, there's a new way of implementing this type of software. I'd say a couple of years ago, we would have walked into any client, and we would have said, what would you like? Yes, we've got loads of good practice, but fundamentally we'd have sat there and said to the client, what would you like us to go and do? And we would have started looking at their spreadsheets, we would have started, having big workshops with them, and we'd start with a blank sheet of paper to some extent, in that sort of scenario, and we'd build it up from there. And that could take a long time, that could take an awful amount of time. And actually, sometimes what I would say is you'd be getting the bad practice that you're talking about and actually writing it down and then building it into a system.
Yeah.
Whereas what we're now doing with the cloud is we're leveraging all the good practice that we've got from all of our clients, from multiple implementations, and the good practice that the software vendors, such as Oracle, also bring us. And we're going to clients and saying, this is how this good practice works. So if you want to do staff cost planning or project-based planning, this is the best way to go and do it. Tell me why in your organisation does that not work?
What sort of reaction do you get? Do you tend to get a bit of pushback on that, or are people grateful for your input? What's the? So
I think that's an interesting. I think it goes back to David's point earlier around sort of the sponsorship, and that takes and the person that is sort of sponsoring the program of work and actually saying, you know what, we are going to move to this new world. We are going to adopt good practice. Therefore, team, people that are involved in that, you need to come on that journey with us. So sometimes it is met with a little bit of frustration, and a bit of resistance. But actually, what you tend to find is once they understand that actually this is good practice, that this means their lives will be, easier in terms of their day-to-day job, and yes, they'll be able to move on to more interesting work. They actually start to come on that journey with you, where we then focus our time and attention is on the things where there are gaps, where things are a bit different. Where you as an organisation do something that is unique, and if that's something that's unique and that adds value, then yes, we need to think about that, and then we spend our time looking at how we do configure the solution to meet those needs, rather than starting from a complete blank sheet of paper.
Yeah, you'd mentioned buy-in there. We'd had a comment. A few minutes ago from John. Thank you, John. Who asks, how can I get buy-in from the board to implement new forecasting and budgeting tools? David, would you like to comment on this?
So I think there's no sort of one set answer. I mean, every organization is different, and clearly the sponsorship that we've kind of touched on a few times now is, the adoption of any tool set or IT system or solution, whatever, is an enabler for a broader change or modernization strategy. And I think that what we've done, and when we look at this, we have some very specific sort of KPI information from the benchmark organizations, from partners like Deloitte, and so we kind of know where improvement, significant or even marginal improvement in some cases, just depends on what the area is. But I think we have a lot of evidence of where the business case can be derived from. And so those data points, and every company is a little bit different, but I think the areas of improvement in terms of forecast accuracy, and we know sort of empirically through stuff McKinsey's done and other companies around, the companies that are leveraging these analytics throughout the processes they're trying to modernize, it has a positive impact on revenue and margin and whatnot. So we can look at working capital, we can look at lots of different aspects about how resources are allocated. But I think we've been through, we're sort of several thousand customers now in terms of planning, budgeting, finance modernization, as it were, globally. And everyone's a little bit different, and the catalyst for change and the business case that supports that change is a little bit different. But I think we've seen most of the permutations. So we can sort of work with organizations to say, here is the sort of short, medium, longer term benefit. These are very explicit, quantifiable benefits, and these are more, when you start talking about user adoption and user productivity, to the extent we're pragmatic about how hard that gets baked into the business case. But I think what we found is that for the companies that are on this journey, and it's important to note, I think, that we might talk about a direction of travel, that you want to think about what ultimately the target operating model or the transformational agenda is, even if your journey is very small. So we've talked about this, that you can have a very specific modernization agenda around a process or a function to deliver that initial value, which is kind of the beachhead. And then once companies tend to see that value, they think, okay, well, actually, that went better than expected. And we got a lot of evidence to highlight, companies that have done that as sort of a tactical approach, but with a strategic mindset. So that tends to work well.
Yeah, and I think I completely agree with David's point there in terms of, it's important, I think, to set for the board the overall direction of travel and what you're trying to achieve. But sometimes I think that can seem like an awful lot of work and a big, a lot to go and do in a short space of time. But actually, if you break that down into some bite-sized chunks and actually pick something where there is an opportunity for you to add a lot of value, derive some benefits, and probably actually, because of the cloud technology, do so more quickly than you previously would have done, then actually you can go back to the board quite quickly with some real life examples and go, yes, that was our vision. We haven't disappeared for a few years and trying to deliver it. Actually, we've gone away in some cases weeks, and we've proven a model that works. And there's some real benefits, and people are being rewarded for that.
Yeah, so sort of starting with the low-hanging fruit, as it were.
Yeah.
In some cases.
Yeah.
But now I've talked about sort of buy-in from the board, but what about in terms of the people actually, in charge, your sort of budget holders or whatever? How is it best to generate buy-in with them, do you think?
So I think that comes down to change management, and I think it's a really key thing to get right. I think sometimes people think this is about a technology solution and that it's going to solve the problems, but actually, business culture, managing change, explaining that to people is as equally important as if not sometimes more important than the actual technology itself. Most projects that I work on, the technology works. Sadly, you find it's the people around that technology that have decided to deviate from something or go and do something or actually say, we're not using that. for various reasons. And actually that's where therefore you do need to spend a lot of time with them. And that's about taking them on the journey. They also need to understand it and understand what the benefits for them are going to go and be.
What sorts of practical things can you do? Is it sort of training courses or an evangelist or?
We've seen that. So in terms of the business change agenda, we've seen some companies identify the super users or the advocates that they know are keen for change. And clearly, change is interpreted different ways by different people. Is it a threat or an opportunity, whatever. But we've seen some successful projects where there was the leadership and sponsorship of what outcomes were desired, and then identifying those individuals through the ranks, line of business roles, who actually would help evangelize and sort of be advocates and proponents of what was coming and super users. And that's worked really well because you say, the IT bit's like one dimension, but you have to get, the right people on board to help kind of promote and get this stuff implemented.
Yeah. And I think there's nothing better than having those super users that you've taken on a little bit of that journey in advance than everyone else, and they really get it, and they can see that this is fundamentally going to change and improve the way they work. And actually having those individuals, rather than an Oracle, rather than a Deloitte, actually go and sell this to people and say, guys, this is really going to change the way we work, and I can really see the benefits. That works wonders, from my experience. That really does. They really get that because they connect with those people, they work with them on a day-to-day basis. So therefore, they really understand it, and I think bringing those people to the party then massively helps with adoption and getting it out there.
You'd mentioned earlier about the sort of automation of non-value add stuff, that's sort of standardising them and letting you really focus on the things that add value to your business. David, I was wondering if you could give me a few sort of practical or real life examples of these sort of things that do add value. Examples of things that have driven value.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I say, we've had companies. If you look back, over the years, as it were. The classic one, I think, is a lot of companies, to the point about business investment and business cases and whatnot. A lot of companies who had a website, the new .com presence, they would sort of build the website because the view of value associated with customer retention or increasing basket size or whatever it might be. They saw kind of a more explicit benefit from modernizing the front end. But as the adage goes, chain's as strong as the weakest link. So where you're saying, well, but your back office is pretty much broken. So you're selling goods out the front end, but in terms of fulfillment and in terms of the actual processes that support that, don't necessarily sync up. So I think the point is that when you're talking about modernization in the digital bit, and we've got some examples lately where companies are saying, I want to differentiate. There was a law firm recently that was talking about modernizing with a mobile app, which they'd be able to show their clients billing status and where they're at in terms of costs associated with a particular case or whatever. And the thing is, they're saying the problem is we get that we'd like to differentiate and build this mobile app, but actually a lot of the back-end systems as to where that billing information comes from and how we sort of provision this. So I think it's about finding the balance of sort of saying, brilliant basics is about making sure the finance operation is efficient, effective, adding value to the other parts of the business. As Martin was alluding, when we're talking about strategic workforce planning support in the HR function or compensation management in the sales and marketing or other operational type things. So I think we try to take a holistic view, as we said, what's the market dynamic for your organization, figuring out how the move to cloud can happen in a pragmatic way, focusing on the sort of value creating things as they are identified, but realizing that if you just kind of, it's tough to jump just to the value bit without making sure the back end and some of the other parts of the business are in a fit state and the data can be managed. And
yeah, I like your point about the website. I guess retail would be a really good example of that, in that if you had a website with all the bells and whistles on, but they never got the goods, then that sort of it completely blows the point out of the water, really, doesn't it? So.
I think pretty much most industries you can find examples of where they've attempted to kind of tweak or polish or modernize one bit, but the relationship to the other systems that sit behind it could be quite flawed, and therefore the benefit is marginalized.
Martin, have you come across, I'm sure you have come across plenty of examples that have driven value, but are you able to share any sort of practical things?
Yeah, it's funny actually that you mentioned the retail one, because I've worked with a couple of retailers where they've hit that exact problem. They've invested heavily in their front end, only to realise that actually from a back office perspective, from a finance, they just can't simply do any more, and therefore they are at the point where, as you say, what's the weakest link? And the weakest link in that organisation was actually some of their finance back office processes. So now actually to go and add any more value to the front end of their website and their retail business, they are now looking at the back end and their back office functions and fundamentally changing that, because they will achieve no more value from that front-end customer-facing website unless they really go and change that.
And the planning, budgeting sort of perspective on that is the what-if scenarios. Are we selling the right products to the right people? And we have examples with lending organizations who are starting to kind of look at who they focus on, what's the demographic. So they don't want the higher risk, bad payers, as it were. They want to focus on the cream. And they're challengers, as it were. There's a company in the States that's doing this, and the traditional banks will kind of look at a portfolio of risk associated with who they're loaning money to, and they'll take the good with the bad to an extent. But there are some companies that are coming up that are focusing purely on the value bit, doing it in the cloud, doing it quickly, and just they're very disruptive. So these things are happening.
Fantastic. Right. We've had plenty of questions coming in. Thank you very much for those. So I guess we've had a question from Graham Y. Well, it's more of a comment, but he said, I guess people trust what they've used for a long time and are suspicious of change. Martin, how have you sort of approached that when, if you've ever come across people who've been sort of suspicious of the cloud for one reason or another?
Yeah, so I think that is it's definitely something I've seen. People do like, we've talked about spreadsheets a lot this morning.
Yeah.
People do like their little trusted, the spreadsheet that they have loved and developed and sort of looked after as their own child for a number of years, and it's their little baby. And therefore, it comes back to that change management piece that we talked about earlier around them, understanding why that change is happening, understanding what some of the benefits are going to be for them, and taking them on that journey, and also demonstrating to them that actually we have not only taken, the great functionality and no doubt the great things that they've built into that sort of what they're used to in their business process, but we've also improved it, and they can see that, and they can actually take that forward, and they're going to get some real benefits from that. But it is something we see quite on a regular basis.
Interesting. Good question here from Peter, who asks, how do we decide how much we should spend on a system? Interesting question.
Clearly the return on investment and the value derived as part of a business case. I guess it's interesting. Every company in every industry is a bit different, but again, there's no right or wrong answer to that question. I think it's fundamentally almost the view, the perspective, the philosophy is to say, well, I used to spend a lot on these components that made up my IT landscape. They supported the business in a fashion, but the demands of the business are changing, and I'm really struggling to respond to that. So I think this is where, unlike perhaps some projects that were sort of IT funded, or IT was looking at a way to sort of rationalize and be able to manage that complex IT landscape better, I think this is where the business is so crucial to kind of saying, so in the HR function, in the finance function, in sales and marketing and operations, the need to change, the need to kind of have that leadership, that sponsorship and that kind of to get buy-in. It has to be sort of top down, and then get your super users, as we were saying before, to kind of help advocate and evangelize this stuff. But I think the fact is that the business case for change is very compelling, but what companies are saying increasingly is it's not just about cost, it's about survival, and it's about, if the market's flat, then I'm only going to get market share by out executing my competitors, and to do that, I need to be really efficient. So those operational efficiencies are crucial. And I think we have enough empirical evidence now around benefits realization and business cases, and some benefits customers say we expected, and some we didn't expect. Everything from narrative reporting to whatever. So there's lots of dimensions to this. So it's sort of case by case, but I think we have enough evidence behind us with a huge track record of global projects that have happened and are happening that we can convey that.
And I think linked to that, we've been talking, we're talking about the cloud as well. And I think if you compare, what you had to spend in some respects, historically with say an on-premise solution of some description, there would be, yes, I have to go and buy a load of software licenses to go and do this. I have to go and buy a load of IT hardware. I'm probably going to go and need some IT people to actually go and, switch it on and put the CD in and start it up. I'm going to need people to support that going forward. And actually, the move to the cloud has changed that fundamentally. That is now all taken care of by a vendor, and you can subscribe. Just like we're used to I think in our personal lives, we're very used to this now, to subscribing to things and getting a service for that. That is now what you've got for this enterprise-wide type software. You can subscribe to it, and actually, therefore, it does change the cost model. And actually, going back to our point earlier, is where you might be able to start small and then evolve and scale it at a later point in time. You could start this with a small number of users. If you've got something you want to go and fix, you could start that in that sort of space. And that will help with that. What are you spending, and what is the right amount to go and spend, because you can prove it.
Yeah, and I guess the move towards sort of renting the software, in effect, I guess it makes it a little bit more accessible to small and medium enterprises as well as those sort of on the enterprise level. Almost, I think I've heard you use the term in the past, David, of sort of democratizing software, as it were.
Yeah, so some of the barriers to entry, everybody always wanted the best software, but couldn't afford it. And so clearly, the accessibility now to real, top-end enterprise class capability, but on the sort of, software as a service, OpEx rental model is proving really popular amongst smaller and mid-sized companies. So, and it's interesting for us because we're going from sort of being a software vendor to a service provider. So our culture and model at Oracle is also changing massively in support of how we're ensuring that the provision of this service, the continuity of it, the performance, the availability, and all these sort of operational characteristics. And most of the customers we deal with are saying, we have an IT shop, we need to ensure that it helps us with the governance. And clearly, I think it's really important to just comment that whatever the route to cloud, hybrid clouds are often the term we use to say that there's a lot of legacy assets, a lot of capability that is not going to be turned off overnight. So this transition to cloud is not kind of although we can implement it quite quickly and get to the point of value quickly, clearly it's a journey. So it's trying to find the right architectures and the right model that allows you to govern both the existing and the new, but in kind of a hybrid world, which we have a lot of skill in, as do Deloitte, and this is kind of the reality.
You've mentioned this hybrid cloud a couple of times. You've actually had a question in from Kate. She says, we run into problems with connecting new applications to our existing, needing to aggregate data from multiple departments and give those departments cross-function reporting. How are new cloud systems addressing integration? Martin, do you want to field this one?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the, so we've got quite a lot of experience in this, and we're seeing this more and more, as David alluded to, around actually people are sitting in a world where they've got multiple enterprise resource planning systems or core finance systems. They might have multiple other sales systems, whatever they be. Some of those might now be on premise. Some of those might also be in the cloud. And the great thing that we find with the cloud and the experience we've got is that we can put tools, planning, budgeting, forecasting tools and reporting tools that are on the cloud, and they can access other cloud products. They can also access on-premise products. And actually we can provide that single version of the truth. We can aggregate all that data together, I think, as the person's asking on the question. Yeah. And we can do that. And that is perfectly, it's actually quite a standard, it's a standard architecture that we now work towards with a lot of our clients, because we reckon, there are very few very simple clients who've got, a nice clean landscape. Everyone has a few few different systems, and they want data out of all of them to go and do their reporting.
So it's sort of teething problems in effect as a sort of first cloud software struggled to integrate, or, you know, was that a fair assessment, David?
Yeah, absolutely. I've used the term Franken-cloud many times, which is a lot of the first generation clouds. If they were being presented to a line of business user, the interface and the reports and it all looked good, but complex IT doesn't disappear because of cloud. You know, it's not the panacea. So clearly, you know, when you're looking at more mature cloud vendors and more mature cloud capabilities, you know, we're looking at data wherever it may exist. How do we move it in and out of public cloud, private cloud, on-premise, your data center, our data center? So it's kind of you know, having that sort of architectural, holistic view that says, you know, the cloud is a good thing. You know, we think it's going to help automate, standardize businesses, drive a lot of value, et cetera, et cetera. But the reality is, you know, IT is often very complex, and I think what we're talking about today is that, you know, you can drive the business value, but make sure. I mean, I know some of the IT functions in the market were sort of bypassed in the early days of cloud, and there was just the line of business saying, it's my budget, I'm going to buy it. And now we're kind of in this world saying, no, you don't want to stitch this stuff together in an inappropriate way, which is just creating new complexity outside your firewall, just like you had behind your firewall before. You've now put it in the cloud. What's the point? So it needs to kind of, you know, you need to kind of look at this stuff clearly about good architectures. You know, they don't disappear. Complexity doesn't disappear just because you go cloud. Yeah, and I think, you know, the robustness of the solutions that we're talking about here do allow for these patterns. Software as a service layer, the platform as a service layer is allowing for, you know, whether it's BI reporting or other things to manage it.
Good stuff. We're running out of time, I'm afraid, but well, time for one final question that links in quite nicely, you know, with a sort of roundup, as it were. So Mike says, I'm still a bit of a cloud skeptic. Some of the benefits are things that can be done by using existing systems more effectively. So, you know, are you able to just wrap up a few sort of top tips for sort of cloud planning and budgeting for us, and try and convince Mike, the cloud skeptic?
What would be one of my top tips? Yeah, I think we've alluded to already, but, you know, think about what the future vision is going to be. Definitely do that. But at the same time, think about how you can break that down into bite-sized pieces, okay? Because I think you can, with cloud technology, definitely add value and deliver real benefit to the business quicker than you have previously been able to do. And therefore, actually, if you break down, you know, what you want to go and do into small bite-sized pieces, there'll be something there which, you know, currently causes you some real pain and some real challenges, and you can pick that and you can go fix it, and you'll get some real benefits really quickly.
Brilliant, thank you. David?
Yeah, I echo all of that, really. I mean, I think we were talking earlier about the fact that historically companies said, oh, I'm going to put this system in vanilla, but nobody ever did, right? The tools, the circumstance, the lack of governance, complexity just crept into these systems, and sometimes through acquisitions. You know, new companies were brought on board or divested, and I guess the bottom line is that we have a better chance now of an enforced rigor or governance around keeping things standardized that should be standardized, and we think cloud helps us do that. And so I think what we would challenge any company is to say, if everything you do is perfect and your market share is growing and your margins are growing, your revenue growing, great. You know, you probably don't need us. But most companies have difficulty in part, whether it's around operational efficiency or trying to fend off, you know, competitors that are non-traditional competitors for them. So everybody's trying to think about how they can innovate. And I think, you know, cloud's not sort of the panacea, but it is part of an approach and a strategy that can help companies modernize in a sensible way.
David Hobson, Martin German, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for attending. Thank you for sticking with us. We've had a few questions in about the Amazon Echo that you could win by attending today. Here it is. And so we will be sending out an email after the session is finished to one lucky winner for the Amazon Echo. There will also be an on-demand version of this webinar available shortly after we've finished here. and you'll be getting an email when that's available, and there'll also be a follow-up article on accountingweb.co.uk. That's it for now. Thank you so much for tuning in, and goodbye.